Jordan Brooke-Barnett, CEO the AUSVEG SA. Tomato brown rugose fruit virus. Wow, that's quite a mouthful. Anyway, first of all, thank you, Jordan, for coming on to Radio Italia in Adelaide to talk about this.
You're welcome.
Let's explain to the listeners who is AUSVEG SA, which you are the CEO.
So it's the easy way to think about it is so we're an industry association that conducts political advocacy. So you think of, if you're an employer group, you'd have a union. We're the sort of the same for the business at the business level, representing a really diverse industry of market gardeners, broadacre vegetable growers, but everything under the sort of umbrella of our $2.5 billion vegetable sector. We have a lot of diverse and vibrant communities, a big Italian community, a big Greek community amongst our members, but also Vietnamese, Cambodian and Sikh. So if you sort of think about our industry, it's sort of the traditional market gardens that were north of Adelaide that used to be in places like Campbelltown that have moved north, the greenhouses, and anything through to the Riverland where we have sort of broadacre onions and potatoes. So it's a very diverse industry, but certainly when we're talking about this virus, tomatoes is a big part of what we do, the third largest crop in South Australian horticulture.
Well, you said a number there. Was it 2 point something billion? Seems like a lot of business.
It is. So that's about that's obviously retail. So when you think about the produce, but we grow about 40% of Australia's onions in this state. We're home to the largest protected cropping or greenhouse industry in the Southern Hemisphere. We produce around 80% of South Australia's fresh market potatoes and 40% of the potatoes that Australians rely on for chipping and processing. So we're an industry where each state specialises in their own industry, but we're particularly strong in greenhouse production and also potatoes in this state where we have large Australia, if not Southern Hemisphere, world-leading producers.
And actually a fair amount of innovation too, but we can probably come back to that in a minute. So this tomato virus, so tomato brown rugose fruit virus, what does it do? It affects the fruit or the plant?
It's primarily it affects the marketability of the plant in that it causes blemishes, but its real concern is to the health of the plant. It wilts and obviously across a large greenhouse, I think we see anywhere between 15 to 30% yield. The worst case that I guess the department's raised, the department here of agriculture said 75%. But talking to our fellow growers overseas where they manage this disease, it's anywhere between 15 to 30%. So it's primarily in this instance been limited to a few commercial facilities, and we suspect it's either come in on either equipment, or it could be worker movements, or it could be seed. But in the case of it being seed, because I would imagine there's a lot of home gardeners in your audience, and people who make sauce and see it in the market every year. The varieties that we suspect will be commercial varieties that will be different to the ones that you'd see in a garden nursery and the ones you'd typically be growing in your backyard. So right now we're in a scenario where it's relatively contained. Yes, it's an enormous cost for those affected businesses to bear, and we've seen the largest greenhouse in Australia effectively be put under quarantine. But for the broader industry at the moment, we're continuing to trade in most markets, and for the home gardeners, things are relatively unaffected.
Okay, so you're talking about quarantines. I'm wondering if we could make comparisons with the COVID epidemic or pandemic, where we were locked up for a while and tried not to have contact with other people. Is that a worthwhile image to use?
It is. It's a very evocative image. I call this tomato COVID because a lot of the same psychology applied, in that you have the science and you have this idea of risk and how much risk you're willing to take. So if I were to talk to my growers, they would often say to me, the quarantine is worse in many cases, or the threat of the loss of markets is worse than the disease itself. And I think that's a fair assessment. We don't want to get anything in this country, but the fact is we're a global industry. We're pulling in. It doesn't matter whether it's for the home nursery or the commercial sector. Everything that we do is, from global seed companies, all these pathways of movements of people. The fact is we're going to get a lot of these things, and we do often default to what we call an eradication response, in that we try and contain and eradicate. And that's a really, really big cost on the first businesses who get it. And in fact, what often happens is we pursue eradication, and then we find out that it's here later, and you go, well, why did we go through that? And it mirrors that zero COVID response in a lot of cases, in that, we were very slow on the borders, and sorry, very strong on the borders in the first few months. That became restrictive. We saw what that did to the economic flow, because let's face it, we're a national economy, and food's no different, with transport links interstate and these sorts of things. I think we may have contained it, but I'll believe it like a few months ahead. I'd be surprised if it's here that it's not elsewhere. It could be a very isolated
Okay.
instance. But certainly, in the case of a lot of these diseases, I think we've got to actually have more of a think as a country about what we actually do, because even if we do eradicate this, it comes at a very, very high cost to a lot of the growers, and a significant angst to commercial growers who've lost individual markets as well. So we have to sort of assess it. Overseas, there are tools in place. So they've had this in the Netherlands for about 10 years and developed a lot of, both for the garden and commercial use protections. I think for home gardeners as well, if the stock is clean and you're not propagating or cutting, because it sort of tends to move when you cut a plant and get it on your fingers, there'll be ways to actually protect it, to protect the nurseries. So we've got to sort of ask ourselves moving forward, how scary is this thing really? Our commercial growers aren't as afraid of it as the regulators, and that's a fact in a lot of these instances. But I think it's safe to say we'll wait and see, and we'll see if we can eradicate this thing. But moving forward, even if it got here into the industry, home gardeners, there's plenty of tools at place to manage it. We've seen
So
other
you can
things go
live with
through,
it. Yeah.
like citrus canker, the leaf miners that we see in some of those lines. So
Yeah.
is this more scary than them? Well, it's kind of arguable.
Yeah. Okay. We'll tease out some of those things. Jordan Brooke-Barnett, CEO, the AUSVEG SA. So, Jordan, you've given us an overview of a few elements. Let's tease out some of them. One, you said it can damage the marketability or the yield of the plant. What does that mean? And is it dangerous for us if we eat the fruit from these plants?
So there's no risk to human consumption. I think that's been said a lot of times. I think sometimes when people hear the word virus, we associate it with other things, but no, the fruit in all forms is perfectly healthy to eat. In terms of the plant, generally we see these sorts of diseases affect plant vigor. So you'll see like a browning and a wilting. It affects the health of the plant. When you look at a commercial sort of crop where you'll have a lot of plants in a row, there'll be a certain amount eventually that gets sick and wilt and die out. Like I said, under management overseas, they'll generally identify the plant, take it out of the greenhouse, and address it. And it affects the yield and the appearance of the fruit. So you'd see a splotching of the fruit, a yellow and red type splotching that you'll see in some of the media. Those are typically the symptoms that you would see.
Like some spots on the fruit. Yeah.
Yeah, a response on the fruit. That it'd be visible in that regard, and just in the general health of the plant. You'd know pretty well if it was a sick plant.
Yeah. But the fruit itself, it doesn't do damage to human beings. Is that what you're saying?
No, completely safe to eat. Completely safe to eat in all forms.
Yeah. And just before I came onto air, my colleague said that they'd had some questions about this. Can this virus affect other plants that are similar to tomatoes, like eggplant, potatoes, capsicum? The
Yeah,
soil
so
makes it.
the three known host crops are tomatoes, chilies, and capsicums. It doesn't jump across to other solanaceae like
Okay.
potatoes and things like that, to our knowledge. And certainly in all my correspondence with the government on this, they've simply said tomatoes, capsicums, and chilies as the host crops for this one.
Okay. So it won't affect the aubergines, the eggplant, or the potatoes. Good, 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 good. And the fruit, even if it looks a bit different, it's not perfectly okay. It's actually okay to eat. So
Yeah.
actually, on that point, some farms have been quarantined here, South Australia. I've heard that interstate they're not taking fruit from certain farms. Is that going to affect how much we've got available to buy in the shops and supermarkets?
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about pricing. I think it's a very
Okay.
valid question, Antonio. Um, so right now, if you're unaffected by this virus, and there's a certain amount of trace properties which are actually getting cleared, we've had the vast majority of their testing come in, and it's looking like being free facilities. But say you're clear from the virus, you can trade in South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, and the NT. So Queensland is out for all South Australian fruit. That's a hard ban.
Mhm.
And for WA, they will accept our fruit in roughly a month or however long it takes to negotiate what we call a trade protocol. And that's likely to mean that our commercial growers will test before harvest. And once they can prove they're clear, they'll access WA as well. So the only real firm loss is Queensland. I'd say that they probably need our fruit in South Australia very acutely at certain times of year. So I'm hoping at some point they come to the table to negotiate similar to WA, because we might be at sometimes a year providing 70 to 80% of their commercial
Oh,
capsicums,
wow.
chilies, and tomatoes. And it's a similar story on the East Coast as well. So when I have a look at the supply picture, it's obviously very fluid. So we've had a major greenhouse being Wild Rules Perfection Fresh, because they've been in the media. They are a very large producer. They're one of about 7 producers of their scale in Australia. And there's another 3 of them in the state. So while they are a big footprint, there is a lot of production. There's still a lot of production in the state. We're home to the largest protected cropping industry in the Southern Hemisphere, north of Adelaide here. Um,
Wow.
I don't know what will happen. If we're talking about prices locally, I would imagine that they will remain steady or lower. And certainly, as other states close, we're actually in a supply and demand situation where we've got a glut. Where we will see high prices, because they have talked about high prices, I would imagine it would be in East Coast markets that block our supply. Although you never know. I would say at present, Victoria and New South Wales won't experience it because they can still accept our fruit. But it may well be in Queensland where those scenarios play out. Where we've been talking about $30 a kilo. I don't think that'll
Wow.
happen.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
then again,
$30 a kilo. Yeah.
what we don't know, markets aren't fluid either. Sorry, markets aren't static; they're fluid. It's a trading market, so it may well be that more Victorian produce goes up to Queensland, and then more of ours goes to Victoria as well. So,
Yeah.
my role as an industry advocate through this is when this disease dropped, we could have had every state in Australia potentially shut the doors on us. We've managed to keep most of it open by showing them that they can have confidence in what we're doing in testing. Um, but they also need our fruit as well. So having access to the vast majority of markets is a much better scenario than just South Australia growing for itself, because there's no state in Australia really for some commodities that could just grow their own supply. We see it in potatoes. A lot of these major crops might be situated in 2 of the states. So we actually, today in Australia need to be able to source our produce from everywhere else in the country.
Okay. So, and actually, that's another connection with COVID. Since COVID and the lockdowns and supply chain disruptions, even governments have been talking about economic sovereignty and protecting and putting resilience into the supply chain. So having a diversity of supply is important, and there's probably a premium coming to it. Now let's go back to the issue about you said in the Netherlands in particular, they live with it. They're managing with this disease, just as we human beings live with diseases that used to be life-threatening. What sort of tools are there and protocols to deal with this virus?
So over there, they have a number of controls. One, with their plant breeding, they've been able to breed a certain degree of resistance
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
varieties. So that's that, and that's not DNA like DNA genetic modification. That's that like traditional breeding methods that
Yes.
the Dutch
Yes.
use. They in the greenhouses and nurseries have exceptional crop hygiene, and if you try and get into one of these facilities, it's like getting into a jail or Fort Knox. They'll have
Yeah.
hygiene and wear disposable clothing and things. They have automated processes and sterilization of things like grafting, where you're cutting a plant, which is that's susceptible to the disease. So if you cut it with one knife and cut another plant, that's the way of it spreading. So they have sort
Yeah.
of automatic grafters that sterilize each time they use the knife and all
Right.
kinds of technologies. But they basically aim to keep it out of the nurseries. I think if you were keeping the stock clean, it would be very easy for a home gardener to actually maintain it. If you had a clean seedling in a home garden, well, it's not there with a whole lot of other crops. You're not having workers in and out. It's a relatively stable environment. So I think for the home garden, it's about keeping the nursery stock clean. For commercial producers, they try and keep it out of their greenhouse or their crop. And that's through like what we call crop hygiene. So limiting the movement of workers, very similar to human hygiene, sterilizing each bit of equipment, not moving workers between greenhouses and production
Yeah.
facilities. So you have a containment strategy, but those are the main tools. It's a very similar hygiene approach that we saw in COVID. There's no magic medicine or spray you can use. This is purely a keeping it out using technology and proper crop hygiene.
Okay, so that's interesting. You don't have vaccines for it, but breeding resistance into the plants is an interesting technique as well as the containment. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jordan. Is there any other important point that you would like to add at this stage? And we've covered quite a bit of territory on this topic. And we know it's an important part of the South Australian economy that's potentially at risk here.
It,
Is
it,
actually there's been talk of potential compensation for these three farms in particular. What's happening there, do you think?
Well, yeah, we're hopeful that a deal can be done. A lot of those arrangements are national. So for the ones who take the brunt of this, we call them owner reimbursement costs that usually apply when we have this sort of response. So we've reached out via the federal government to say, well, can they apply here? So that's a case in progress. But you really hope, because these businesses have done the right thing and put their hand up and reported, that they're not in any way disadvantaged. The only other point I'd make, Antonio, is just your listeners might not really understand just how big this industry is. And I think
Yeah.
some of the government figures undersell it, because I can count on two hands, 10 businesses that I know make up more than what's been quoted at 230 million. I estimate it to be more than, probably 500, 600 million farm gates.
Oh,
Um, and that means it's about just over 1 billion retail that we grow in this state. Back of an envelope, and just from what I know of the industry, we estimate that we produce around a third of Australia's tomatoes and capsicums out of this state. The other main
yeah.
state being Queensland, and the rest spread between Victoria and WA. And at counter seasonally, we would be supplying other states with 70 to 80% of their produce. We're talking, potentially in our industry, the greenhouse sector of our industry alone. So that's discounting the field broccoli and stuff that you'd see out there. There's probably around 6 to 8 thousand jobs. Most of those direct, but for every job, there's another 1.6 in the local economy. So the townships of Virginia, Angle Vale, The supply chain is almost entirely reliant on some of these producers, and people don't always see that because we're living up in a lot of these towns, but the local pub, the local supermarket in
Yeah.
these areas is almost entirely bound by the fortunes of high-tech horticulture. So, it is an immensely important sector. We're a high turnover, high spending, low margin industry. I have nothing but admiration for the families that do it. They turn over a lot. They accept millions of dollars of risk. They might be turning over, $8 million a year, but only receiving 1% back net. So that shows you. And when you have a crop failure like this or a quarantine with the margins involved, it's just that hard. So I think for your listeners to support our growers, we need people buying tomatoes more than ever. Rest assured that your tomatoes in your backyard should be right. That's until I tell you they're not, but I don't think that's likely. I think we're in a contained situation. But keep buying our produce and supporting our great growers here in the state.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was impressed when I heard that 500 people were going to be stood down from that one farm, but I think they found jobs mostly elsewhere. Again, thank you, and thanks for Dino Mussolino for putting me in touch with you. It was a good connection. He told me you'd be very informative and helpful. So that's been absolutely correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio.